On November 1st, 1975, William Sullivan, former Assistant Director, Domestic Intelligence Division of the FBI, testified before the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. He related that from late 1963 and continuing until the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., King was the target of an intensive campaign by the FBI to neutralize him as an effective civil rights leader. Sullivan stated that in the war against King, no holds were barred. This and other testimony describing this FBI counterintelligence campaign against King reached the public through news media. As a consequence, there was a regeneration of the widespread speculation on the possibility that the Bureau may have had some responsibility in Dr. King's death and may not have done an impartial and thorough investigation of the assassination. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is perhaps the most famous civil rights activist of all time. And that's not necessarily for good reasons or a good thing at all. Today, you'll hear many people who don't even subscribe to racial equity, reparations, equal opportunity, or anything loosely related to those things. You'll hear those people still twist and use the words of Martin Luther King to further their agendas or ignore the important issues altogether. But what if I told you that when Martin Luther King Jr. was alive, he was actually the most hated man in America, and there were very important people conspiring in the shadows to make sure that his life was cut short? Well, that would be the truth. I'm Andre, and this is the Redacted History Podcast. Between the March on Washington in 1963 and Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in April of 1968, J Edgar Hoover and the FBI did everything that they could to discredit and take down Martin Luther King Jr. They followed, wiretapped, threatened, bugged, and blackmailed him in a relentless campaign to dethrone him as the head of the civil rights movement. You can go to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's website and find an entire vault of FBI records declassified for the public to see. 200 plus pages of the FBI's admission to their undertakings as it pertains to Martin Luther King Jr. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, J Edgar Hoover and the FBI did as much as they could to make life absolutely miserable for Martin Luther King Jr. J Edgar Hoover was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI, and he remained in this position from June of 1935 until his death on May 2nd, 1972. And he was perhaps the biggest rival of Martin Luther King Jr. What Hoover might best be known for is COINTELPRO, or the Counterintelligence Program. This was a secret FBI program that ran from 1956 to 1971. The program aimed to disrupt and neutralize political organizations deemed to be a threat to national security. This included groups such as the Communist Party USA, the Black Panther Party, and the American Indian Movement. The tactics used by COINTELPRO included surveillance, infiltration, propaganda, and disruption. The FBI used wiretapping, mail opening, and other forms of covert surveillance to gather information on political groups and individuals. They also used infiltrators and spies to disrupt the activities of these groups that they deemed dangerous by sowing mistrust and causing internal conflicts. In addition to these tactics, the FBI also used propaganda to discredit and disrupt political organizations. This included planting false stories in the media, leaking false information to journalists, and creating fake documents altogether to create the appearance of criminal activity. The COINTELPRO program has been widely criticized for violating the civil rights of individuals and groups targeted by the FBI. Many activists and organizations were harassed, wrongly arrested, and even killed as a result of the program. Well, the FBI's real push and gravitation towards Martin Luther King started in 1961. One of the FBI's main concerns with Martin Luther King was that they had reason to believe that he was being heavily influenced by the Communist Party. Now remember, this is the mid-1900s. Communism is America's #1 enemy. Now, this began with Martin Luther King's relationship with a white man named Stanley Levinson. Levinson was an American businessman and lawyer who became a close friend and advisor to Martin Luther King. He became an advisor to King, most notably in the 1950s, and remained in King's circle until his assassination. Now, Levinson actually served as a ghostwriter for Martin Luther King and an active fundraiser, and had denounced all ties to the Communist Party once he became a member of King's circle. But J Edgar Hoover did not care, and he went on record to condemn the Communist Party whenever he could. Between 1962 and 1963, Director Hoover went back and forth in communication with the then Attorney General at the time, who was Robert Kennedy. In short, the FBI was basically saying, hey, we think this MLK guy, the black guy leading the civil rights movement and trying to lead black people to freedom, we think he is a communist. Yeah, him. This came to a head in the summer of 1963 when JFK recommended that surveillance be placed on Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is an African-American nonprofit organization, and Martin Luther King Jr. was actually the first president of this organization and remained in that position until he was killed. Members of the FBI would even go as far as to book hotel rooms in the same hotel that MLK was staying in. They would book rooms down the hall or above and below MLK's rooms and listen in on all of his conversations. Now, they didn't disclose all of this to Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General. Now, Attorney General Kennedy eventually took back his approval for the surveillance of Martin Luther King, but eventually gave in again and allowed further surveillance. He also allowed wiretaps on the home of Stanley Levinson. Now, even with all of his approval, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI still insisted on launching illegal surveillance efforts towards Martin Luther King. Now, also in 1963, Martin Luther King's stock rose significantly, because that's when he gave his I Have a Dream speech. In this speech, Martin Luther King Jr. did nothing but call for an end to racism and advocated for equal rights in America. The speech was delivered to over 250,000 supporters on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. We all know the speech. We all know the famous lines. And merely days after Martin Luther King gave this momentous, inspiring speech, the FBI declared him as the most dangerous and effective Negro leader in the country. Now, over the course of this year, Martin Luther King Jr. was advised over and over and over again by government officials to distance himself from the people in his circle that they thought could be communists. Martin Luther King denied that there were any communist influences in his circle and that he was himself not a communist. He went on record to say, "It's amazing that in spite of our long night of oppression and discrimination, that the Negro has remained loyal to America." Folks also advised Martin Luther King Jr. to not get into public altercations or back and forths with J. Edgar Hoover. And in November of 1964, J. Edgar Hoover called King the most notorious liar in the country. Now, MLK and Hoover actually had a sit down in December of 1964. Hoover went on record in an internal memo afterwards that he basically used the meeting as a deflection and just used it to explain the organization's functions to MLK. Basically treated him like he was 5 years old. King, on the other hand, used the meeting to apologize for any remarks that he had ever made that offended the FBI, and he actually praised the work of the FBI. Now, I doubt that he meant any of that, but hey, perhaps the most embarrassing and unforgiving attempt at discrediting Martin Luther King Jr. came in 1964. The FBI had already been keeping a close eye on King, surveilling his whereabouts, bugging his house, his hotel rooms, listening in on his conversations, and basically following him everywhere he went. Now, these measures found no evidence of King conspiring with communist powers, but they did find evidence of extramarital affairs that King was having, which really wasn't a gotcha. It was more of an already open secret. Hoover and the FBI then began to peddle evidence of these relationships to the press, and to their shock and dismay, these stories went absolutely nowhere. In fact, Martin Luther King was actually becoming a bigger and more loved figure in America. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed and King won the Nobel Peace Prize. In November of '64, the FBI sent a letter to King, which came to be known as the suicide letter. The note is single-spaced and tightly written. The letter was clearly meant to mock King. It said, "You are a colossal fraud and an evil, vicious one at that." It described his lovers as evil playmates, all engaged in dirt, filth, evil, and moronic talk. It concludes with a deadline of 34 days before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. There is only one thing left for you to do. The author warns vaguely in the final paragraph. You know what it is. The letter also says, "You're done," and many folks interpret this as urging King to kill himself or be killed. And of course, the FBI has denied this, but why do they really deserve the benefit of the doubt at this point? The ironic thing about the rivalry between Martin Luther King and J Edgar Hoover is that Hoover's main goal was to discredit King and soil his reputation, which never happened. And it is Hoover's reputation who in turn ended up soiled, especially in modern times. Ask anyone today what they think about J Edgar Hoover. Anyone with a brain. The attempt by the FBI to discredit Martin Luther King and his family continued even after his death. Reports state that Hoover okayed a plan to leak a false story to the press that Coretta Scott King wanted to peddle conspiracy theories on King's death to the press. This didn't include the separate efforts to discredit and embarrass Coretta Scott King by looking into her travels and people she kept close relationships with. There was also another report from the Senate Select Committee into investigations concerning post-assassination efforts to make MLK Day a national holiday. The FBI actually tried to motion against it to Congress, citing King's personal background. An investigation into the FBI surveillance actually deemed that the surveillance should have basically been stopped in its tracks in 1963, after they learned that King had no real ties or influence concerning the Communist Party. Shocker. There probably should have been some FBI guys in handcuffs, starting with J. Edgar Hoover. If you look at popular media over the years, movies, TV, the FBI is always championed as the heroes. And I think this story tells us that this isn't the case at all. It's been reported that in his final days, MLK was a very depressed man. 20th, 1958, Martin Luther King was at a book signing at Bloomstein's department store in Harlem, New York, promoting his book, Strides Towards Freedom, which told the story of Rosa Parks' arrest and the subsequent boycott. At 3:30 p.m., as he autographed a copy of his book, Isola Curry, a mentally unstable woman, stabbed him in the chest with a letter opener. King remained awake and alert, sitting in a chair, as several witnesses of the stabbing attended to him. There was discussion about pulling out the letter opener, but they decided to leave the blade in place until he arrived at the hospital. They were able to remove the knife, and King remained in the hospital for a couple weeks because he ended up contracting pneumonia as well. There was also the bomb threat against King's plane before he flew to Memphis for what would be the last time he would ever get on a plane. On April 3rd, 1968, King boarded Eastern Airlines Flight 381 from Atlanta to Memphis. A bomb threat had been called in against the flight, and the captain announced the flight would be delayed. The entire baggage hold was searched, and nothing was found. Just another travel day in the life of Martin Luther King Jr. So between bomb threats, assassination attempts, and constant surveillance by the FBI, it is safe to say that Martin Luther King knew that his time was coming. And this further was evidenced by the phrasing he used in his final speech that he ever gave, titled, "I've been to the mountaintop." This was Martin Luther King's final speech. He talked for a total of 43 minutes, and afterwards he looked exhausted, as if he gave his final bit of life force for this speech. There were tears in his eyes. King collapsed in a chair near the podium, and the crowd gave a raucous standing ovation. A minister named Bill Kyle, who knew King and his oratory very well, said, "I've never heard the intensity or the passion or the drama in his voice and how he was delivering it, and he kept getting stronger and stronger." He would add that King seemed to be preparing for his death by purging publicly the fear. He had to get rid of it. He had to let all that go. It is crazy to think that MLK was accepting his death on stage in front of everybody, a publicly private moment. We all know what happened to Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1968. But who did it? Some say it was a man named James Earl Ray. I say it was America. Until next time. Today's video is not sponsored by a company, rather it's sponsored by my loving, supportive community of patrons over on Patreon. If you like the Redacted History podcast, if you follow me on any social media platforms and like any of the work that I do, consider going over to Patreon and subscribing. That money goes a long way. It's poured directly back into my work, into the podcast, and into my YouTube channels. You can find that linked in the description. Remember to like this video, comment on this video, and subscribe to the channel.